for the Republican Party, so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. We'll see what happens on the Democratic end, but likewise, it's presumed that Hillary Clinton will most likely become the nominee. Any reactions or comments to that before we go into our topic for today? No? All right, cool. Well, for those of you guys who are new to CPU and haven't been to our meeting, just a little bit of rundown of how it works. We're going to go ahead and begin with our guest speaker, who will talk and give their position for about 20-30 minutes. Then after that, we'll open it up to a brief question and answer period for about 10 or so minutes. And then really the main part is the open discussion led by you guys. So really, we encourage everyone, regardless of their position, to just say what they think, if they agree, disagree, if they have an alternative view, whatever it is. And then after that, we'll conclude with a vote on whether or not we agree or disagree with your position. So today's topic, question is, has President Obama's foreign policy strategy been successful? As the presidency of Barack Obama comes to an end, scholars and pundits have already begun to scrutinize and criticize the historical and political implications of his 8 years in the White House. Many presidential candidates in this year's election cycle have brought into the question the success and efficacy of Obama administration's foreign policy, specifically in regards to growing unrest in the Middle East and questionable agreements with countries like Cuba or Iran. Tonight, our guest speaker, David Mortlock, will offer his perspective from working in the White House and argue why Obama's foreign policy has ultimately been successful as a long-game strategy. Mr. Mortlock graduated from Cornell University in 2001 with a BA in governance. Then he received his JD from Georgetown University. He previously worked for 3 years in the White House as Director for International Economic Affairs for the National Security Council. And in addition, he served as Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy at the U.S. State Department. And he's currently partner at Willkie Farr Gallagher in Washington, D.C. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, David Mortlock.
Thanks very much. Thanks. I'm going to stand in front of the podium if that's okay. Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I do get back quite a bit, but usually not at this time of year because it's a little cold and gray. As we can see outside. But it is nice to be here, and I'm glad I made it in under the wire for the end of the semester. Although I'm guessing next week is going to be a more fun week to be here than this one. So I'm sorry to miss that. But I do have some of my fondest memories from Slope Day. So. But I guess we're going to chat today about a little bit about Obama's foreign policy approach and the approach from the last 7.5 years. So I came out of the White House about 4 months ago in December, and I've been on the NSC and then at the State Department for 4 years before that. And so happy to chat a little bit about how the heck that happened and how I ended up where I did, mostly total fluke of luck, but happy to chat about that a little as well. So I'll dive in and definitely, invite some opposition and probing questions here. I'll try and, as you see, I'm gonna, I think hopefully my remarks will be a little bit nuanced and sort of, raise some doubts as well. But I'm going to reframe the question a little bit, or the thesis, I guess. Not has the president's foreign policy been a success, but will it have been a success? Because I think the whole sort of theme of my remarks are going to be about how the president's actions have been looking outward, right? They haven't been for immediate gain. They have been playing the long game. They have been sowing the seeds of what will be foreign policy success in the next administration, in many administrations after that. And I think that as a result, some of those quote successes aren't so obvious right now, and frankly aren't so certain as well, right? Nobody can see the future. I think for several reasons that the president's approach is going to pay dividends. But a lot of those dividends we have not seen yet and are not guaranteed. But I think he is essentially laying the groundwork to see those benefits later. The president's approach, I think the major criticisms, before I get into why I think he's done well, I think the major criticisms are essentially that he's been too timid. right? And so really the question is, look, has he taken a thoughtful, cautious, calculated approach to make a difference where we can and hold back where we cannot? Or has he let crises spin out of control because he's been too timid and been too cautious? And certainly this criticism is being picked up in the current debate in the presidential election. If you look at Donald Trump's speech from about 2 weeks ago, he gave one of his very few speeches with a teleprompter scripted, where he wasn't just speaking off the cuff. He did give a speech on foreign policy, and was a little disjointed, let's say, maybe one way to describe it. But frankly, the sentiments in there, I think, were essentially the anti-Obama, right? He was saying we need to, whack people harder. We need better deals. We need to be stronger. We're weak. We need to be much stronger. We need to, bomb ISIS. But at the same time, he was saying we need to pull back from the world stage. We need to, let Japan and Korea fight their own fights. We need to pull out of NATO. We need to, make friends with Putin, and we need to essentially stop being so chummy with China. And again, all a little disjointed. I'm not sure what the common theme there is, other than essentially the opposite of what the president has done with his approach. But it's not limited to Republicans. It's not limited to Republicans. If you look at Hillary Clinton's rhetoric, right, and what's been written about her, and sort of the messages her surrogates are sending, this phrase that an author in a book, HRC State Secrets, wrote about the proclivity for action. That she has a proclivity for action, and that's essentially the aura that she's trying to create. And frankly, look, that is the way, at least in my experience, I've seen her operate, is, wanting to do something, to take action when the choice is between stand back and go forward. It's not as simple as that, obviously, but that's certainly the message the campaign is trying to send. And you saw it in Bill Clinton's recent remarks as well. He referring to his own administration, recently referred to, it's a good thing to get caught trying, right? And I think the message there is better to do something than not, better to try than not. And it contrasts with the early days of the Obama administration, where, and this is long before I was in the White House, but where the phrase that was attributed to the White House was, don't do stupid stuff, as was the Obama foreign policy, right? And I think that was obviously a reaction to the Iraq War, and essentially, that should be the guiding principle, is, better to hold back than do something stupid that makes the situation worse. And even Hillary has been has publicly questioned that sentiment when asked about it. So I don't think it's just limited to Republicans. It's, there is a strong sentiment among the American public that he's been too timid and too cautious. So I just want to go through a few examples that kind of illustrate this tension in this debate, and explain why I think it was the right path, but there are certainly some questions to be asked. So the first example I want to talk about is China. And China has been discussed in the presidential campaign a lot, obviously. Donald Trump likes to invoke China a lot, that we're losing to China, that we're going to start winning again, and essentially saying that we're going to start a trade war, that we're going to impose tariffs on Chinese goods. And there are some economic reasons why that's not necessarily going to lead to the outcome that he thinks it will. But obviously the message he's sending is that we need to be much tougher on China. And I think essentially the president's approach on China is, he doesn't disagree with that sentiment that we need to be very cautious about China's role in the world and and about countering China's influence over, not just over Asia, but Africa and elsewhere in the region. And the reason is that China essentially is trying to establish a set of international norms that are different from the United States. Right? The United States has taken a certain position on development and developing countries, that there should be a balance between business and human rights, that we need to be protecting indigenous populations, that there should be environmental standards. And the Chinese have taken a different approach, and this comes a lot from their large population, their large territory, that it's ironically for a communist country, it's a very capitalist approach. And not just on the economic development side, but also on the military side, China's trying to expand its influence. The development of the islands in the South China Sea in disputed territorial waters is quite aggressive, frankly. If you've seen those satellite pictures, it's really striking that China has essentially taken these little spits of sand and developed them into airstrips and ports, and with housing for military, and they've now become very strategic jumping off points. So, the question is, do you just start, obviously, if you just start bombing those islands, the situation is going to spin out of control very quickly. So what is the response? And essentially, the president's response has been that the approach to China should not be to hope that they simply accept the international norms respected by the United States and many other countries, but to provide reasons to incentivize and compel China to follow those international norms. And just to give a couple of examples, something on the economic side that I'm more familiar with, is last year China established a development bank, the Asian International Investment Bank, and invited many other countries to get on board. And now there were serious concerns about this bank, the AIIB, right, as a competitor to other institutional development banks that operate in Asia, as well as the IMF and other institutions where the United States has a significant amount of say about what sort of standards are imposed. As I mentioned before, respect for labor rights, environmental issues, and so forth. And the worry was that AIIB was going to essentially do away with those standards, impose China's own view of how development projects should be funded, usually with Chinese companies, with Chinese laborers, with less concern for the indigenous population and environmental standards, and essentially displace the international norms that the United States had worked so hard to establish for development. But China convinced the UK and Italy, France, and Germany, 4 members out of the G7, to join the AIIB. And there was a split among the G7, which essentially tends to be the most like-minded group that the United States is a part of. And that was fairly significant. But essentially, what we ended up doing was working with those members on the inside and on the outside to say to China that no one is being a part of this bank, no one in the G7 is being a part of this bank, unless certain standards are put in place. And the standards that the AIIB has now adopted, or is in the process of adopting, are fairly good and look much more like US standards for development. The other area I'll mention is cyber, right? And the Chinese obviously have been reported, there are plenty of public reports of elements of the Chinese government either themselves conducting or sponsoring private actors conducting cyber espionage, not just cyber attacks, but cyber espionage, the actual theft of trade secrets in the United States and elsewhere. And that obviously is a violation of the international norms that the United States has tried to promote. And so the president signed an executive order threatening economic sanctions against these players that are engaged in this type of cyber espionage. And in the year and a half, approximately since the president signed this executive order, there have been no sanctions imposed under this order. And so, you might say, and plenty of people might say, well, that means that he's not using it, that he's going easy on people. But it's not simply whacking people, it's the threat. It's the threat of sanctions, it's the threat of consequences. And as a result, we have not ended up in a massive trade war. This has been a much more subtle tension between the United States and China, but slowly pushed them in the right direction. Slowly push them in the right direction. And hopefully that approach will be effective in the South China Sea as well. But certainly on the economic and development front, it's been gradually effective, the slow, incremental approach. I also want to talk about, in the context of China, this may not seem obvious, but Ukraine. Right, so how are they connected? And I think this again points to the president going for the long game, is the sanctions and the diplomatic response to Russia's invasion of Crimea and its occupation of eastern Ukraine. Well, I shouldn't say that. Occupation of Crimea, support of the separatist violence in eastern Ukraine. The sanctions that were put in place were the result of a violation of territorial integrity of Ukraine. Obviously, one of the most important international norms that's out there. And you may say, well, those are a failure because Russia's still there. They're still in Crimea. They're still in eastern Ukraine. And that's true. Most immediately, though, you could argue that, look, Putin didn't go further because of the threat of further additional sanctions. But it's also not just about Russia. It's about there being consequences for those violations. And so the response to Russia and the violation of territorial integrity also sends a message to China. It sends a message about the South China Sea. It sends a message that there will be consequences for violating these important international norms. So again, it's not an immediate impact, but it really is establishing this world where there are consequences for acting outside those norms that the US has established. So the next example I want to talk about is Iran. And obviously you've heard a lot about the nuclear deal. There's been a lot of debate on the nuclear deal. And the question with Iran is, that I think is still to be determined, is will the deal succeed? Right? Will Iran cheat? Will they develop a nuclear weapon secretly as they had tried to do before? I don't know. I don't know. But that's the reason the deal is set up the way it is. In order to have consequences if Iran does cheat, if Iran does not comply with the deal, for the sanctions to snap back and be put back in place. And as a result, I would argue that even if the deal fails, it was the right policy. Because the argument is not, has Iran been crushed? Has Iran, stopped? Look, Iran does a lot of things the United States does not like. It's a state sponsor of terrorism. It's intervening in Syria to support Assad. We have a lot of problems with Iran. We don't have diplomatic relations with Iran. We still have significant sanctions on them. But to get the nuclear program halted, to get essentially the breakout period extended from, at the height it was about 2 months away from a breakout period for a nuclear weapon, and now it's at least 12 months. Because Iran did take the actions it committed to, including dismantling most of its centrifuges, shipping out most of its weaponizable fuel, pouring cement in its heavy water reactor. that time period is extended. And if Iran decided to abandon the deal tomorrow, the policy would have been a success because we extended that breakout period. So it's not as though they capitulated, which many in Congress argued that Iran should do. But what was that alternative? To maintain those sanctions until Iran capitulated? Well, it would be very difficult to get the international community to agree to come on board with such an effort in the future. The sanctions on Iran only succeeded because we received cooperation from Russia and China and Europe. The United States had had sanctions, almost a complete embargo on Iran for decades. What changed in 2009 in response to the nuclear program was the cooperation and some compulsion from statutes that the United States put in place, and threats of cutting off those third country companies from the United States. But what really made it possible is the cooperation from those foreign governments and a strong diplomatic effort. So let's say we had sat at the table, we had looked at the deal, and said, sorry, it's just not good enough. You had the rest of the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese sitting there saying, this looks great to us. Well, let's say tomorrow, a new president comes in, tears up the deal, this is terrible, we're not doing it, we're putting sanctions back in place. What would happen? Well, frankly, the immediate consequence would be that it would actually be very difficult to get those sanctions back in place. Because, again, it was the fact that these foreign governments encouraged their companies to abide by the sanctions. But the other problem would be the credibility of the US sanctions. Right? How do we go to a country's next time and say, we've got a problem, we want your cooperation, these sanctions are very limited, they're only in response to this unique, very difficult situation. Our credibility would be shot. So it's not just about this time, it's not just about Iran, it's about the next crisis, it's about the next time we need the Russians and the Chinese to take an economic hit, to pay more for oil, to stop selling car parts and gasoline to Iran. There are real economic consequences to this. They would not agree to do so if they thought there was going to be a bait and switch. That really we were going to leave the sanctions in place, that they weren't limited, that they weren't targeted at what we said they were going to be. You can't put sanctions in place on a nuclear program and then once you agree on steps of the nuclear program, keep them in place because you're concerned about this other issue. And so the administration really threaded the needle with removing those secondary sanctions that they put in place, but keeping the US embargo on to ensure that we still had consequences for those other issues. The third example, sorry, just checking the time. What are we doing for time?
Oh, you're good. You still got like 10 minutes.
Okay, excellent. The third example, the last example I just want to take, which frankly I think is the most difficult, is Syria. And Syria, look, the critical moment for the Obama administration's Syria policy was the red line, right? This was when the president stood at the podium in the press briefing room and said, we have a red line that is the use of chemical weapons. And we will act if we see Assad using chemical weapons. There was a chemical weapons attack. It became clear from newsreels that it was a chemical weapons attack, and it became very clear that it was Assad. And then the aftermath. So everybody assumed, all right, airstrikes. We're going in, and then there was sort of a few days where things went a little awry. There was a vote in the House of Commons in London that rejected the government's plans for airstrikes. There was a decision by the president to take it for a vote in Congress, which then appeared that would not succeed. And so at the end of the day, there were no airstrikes from a US-led coalition or a US participating in the coalition. What there was, though, was a negotiation and an agreement with the Assad regime to give up the cache of chemical weapons that he had, and frankly, it was quite successful. A lot of the materials that Assad gave up, cannot be used. You could say that, well, he's still using conventional weapons every day against the Syrian people, and he is. So how successful was it? And I think this is probably the most difficult question, the most difficult issue of the ones I mentioned here, at least, is, was the red line, the irony is the whole way the red line developed, it did achieve an immediate goal. It achieved the removal of those nuclear weapon materials. Oh, no, sorry, chemical weapon materials. But at the same time, what about our credibility in the long run? What about the fact that the president set the red line? And then, obviously you could say, well, the red line was used, chemical weapons were used. As a result of the red line, Russia was willing to help us negotiate over these chemical weapons. There was a success, but I don't think that's the perception, at least in the mind of the American public, or at least all of the American public. I think there was a general perception that by red line he meant airstrikes, and then we didn't undertake airstrikes. So I think there is a real question over whether the long-term impact of that red line statement and the aftermath, did that do long-term damage? I think that is a good question. And so interested to hear thoughts. But at the same time, I think you could also say that the president did the best in the situation that was presented to us. Syria is an unbelievably difficult situation, unbelievably complicated situation, where you have Russia supporting Assad. If the United States were to go in, would we simply be fighting a proxy war? Would it be the Cold War all over again? And I think there is no easy answer, and that is what's so difficult about Syria. So I think there are 100 different opinions you could have on what the president did, and frankly what the president should be doing now. So I think at the end of the day, I would say on balance that this long game approach is the right one. It's not. It may not be as dramatic or as sexy as starting a trade war or turning northern Iraq into glass, as some of the presidential candidates have said. But it is seeing real results, and I should say it will. I think it will see real results. And also, we're not throwing away resources in the meantime. We're not, most importantly, throwing away lives, and simply to take a symbolic stand to show toughness. There are other ways to show we're tough, to stand by our principles, but to actually be more effective in the long run. And I would argue that the president and his team have done so. So I'll leave it there with respect to the substance. I'm also happy to chat about working in the White House. It seems bizarre to say. I mean, it's not somewhere I thought I would ever end up. Certainly would seem like a dream job when I was sitting here at Cornell. So happy to answer questions about that, or it's frankly it is like any other office. There are office politics. The people are stressed out. They yell at each other. You bang your head against your desk all the time. But at the end of the day, you walk up the steps, and wow, okay, I guess I'm somewhat special. Maybe it's all worth it. And it is all worth it. I mean, it's a very special place to work, and every day I would sit in those meetings and think, oh God, this is it. There's no room next door where all the real people are doing it. This is it. This is where the decisions are being made. This is the conversation that's actually going to result in action by the U.S. government of what we're actually going to do on any number of issues. So my time there, I would say the two key things I got to work on were, I was there in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea and then was supporting the separatists in eastern Ukraine. And so we, responded with the sanctions program. And so developing that sanctions program, it was a really crazy time. In March 2014, we did 3 executive orders in 2 weeks. A lot of meetings in the sit room. It was really nutty, but really fantastic. You get the best experience when things are the most intense. And when the camera's off, I'll tell you a great story about. In the midst of that, there's a good story that involves me falling down a staircase in the West Wing. So it's the whole thing is a little more Veep than West Wing, at least in the TV presentations. That was a real thrill. And then last year, I was the yak for the G7 and G20 process, so these summits have pseudo-official titles of Sherpas and yaks. And the reason is that there is a lot of planning that goes into these summits. The outcomes, you're essentially negotiating agreements on all these different issues on politics and terrorism and health and climate, and it's really you're covering the gamut. So the entire government is involved, but you've got to have one person who's the lead, and so every leader has a Sherpa, and that Sherpa guides the leader to the summit. And so my boss was the Sherpa, and so be the one that sits right behind the president. And then every country also has a yak, because the Sherpa guides the leader to the summit, and the yak carries all the bags. So the metaphorical baggage, I should say. So that was my job, was carrying the metaphorical baggage. But the opportunity to work across all those issues and work with all the different agencies in developing those, many page statements and agreements from the G7 and then later the G20 was really thrilling. And certainly the summits themselves, there was very little sleep. But it was all adrenaline and espresso, and a really incredible experience to see the leaders interact, and see what they would talk about. But also the country teams as well, right? You had the senior most advisors for every one of those leaders together and interacting, and it brings out the best and the worst in people. those moments, they can be pretty intense. So it was a really fantastic experience. I have met the dogs, so maybe that's the most important thing. That was so I can say my time there was complete once I got to pet the dogs. So they are pretty cute. So I'll leave it there. And Fernanda, if you want to take it away.
Yeah. And right now we're going to go ahead and open the floor up for some question and answers. So that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll do probably 10 or so minutes.
Great. Yeah. All right.
I've got a question of twofold about Syria in particular. The first is, what do you think the difference was between our policy reaction on Syria versus the policy reaction on Libya? And also, in hindsight, of course it's 2020, but seeing ISIL, Daesh, whatever you want to call it, come into the region, kind of creating a power vacuum in Syria since the civil war started. How do you think Obama has handled that well, should have handled that differently, or is it best to just sit on it and see how it all plays out?
Gosh, so how is Libya different than Syria? So Libya, I think the biggest difference with Libya was that when Gaddafi, when there really was the uprising in Libya, and the sort of opposition was really moving across Libya. The best way to imagine Libya is, I remember someone telling me right at the beginning, is Libya looks kind of like Ohio. And if you just imagine the opposition, Gaddafi in western Ohio, and the opposition moving from east to west, And that was like the best possible sort of way to describe it to me, so I've always remembered that, and that's how I remember that moment in time when you had the opposition moving from east to west. There was broad international consensus against what Gaddafi was doing. And you certainly had in recent years, I would argue that the sanctions that were placed on Gaddafi in the sort of the 90s were actually a great success because he gave up his chemical weapons program, and imagine what that essentially civil strife would have looked like when Gaddafi was attacking his own people. If he had had a chemical weapons program, it would have looked a lot worse. But as a result of him giving up that chemical weapons program, the sanctions had lifted. He had had a lot of interest with investment. He had had a lot of contact with the international business community. But he didn't really have strong relationships with significant world powers, and certainly no one on the Security Council. And there was broad international consensus to take action against him. And so, look, not just the airstrikes, but you had 2 Security Council resolutions, very quick succession, that froze his assets, that imposed, that blocked the assets of the Libyan Investment Fund, the Libyan National Bank, essentially prevented him from accessing any of those funds abroad. Syria, obviously, there is a significant amount of disagreement about the situation in Syria and who should be supported, and obviously with Russia supporting Assad, with Iran supporting Assad, and in the region the situation is much more complex. Between with Saudi sort of being more suspicious of Iran and Syria, but with a number of other countries supporting Assad, and then the situation inside Syria is much more complicated, right? You have an opposition, but sort of getting even consensus among those who oppose Assad on who the legitimate opposition is has been very